folks are not going to be able to make it tonight. All right. It took us how many weeks to go through Revelation? 26. 26, somewhere around there. Half a year. Half a year. And this is not going to take us that long. Thessalonians is 2 letters that we're going to study together. And y'all are going to learn all kind of cool things about Greek and Roman culture. Kelly and I are actually working on a ancient Greek or Roman recipe, pardon me, that is from this period, and it is a it's called plakinta. It's a cake. It's a cheesecake made with goat cheese and honey and spelt flour, and it's handmade dessert, and we're going to make it for y'all one night. We've got the spelt flour coming because we could not find it in Montgomery or Prattville, Alabama, so it's being shipped in, and we're going to have a authentic Greek dessert to go Roman dessert. I keep saying Greek. So that's, you know how I like food, so that's going to be right up my alley. I mean, I don't turn down a good meal anywhere. And then tonight, we're not going to even get probably to the book of Thessalonians. Tonight, we're going to set up the history behind Thessalonians, and we're going to try our doggonedest to get to Acts chapter 17. That's the goal of the night, to get us to Acts chapter 17. Tonight, we'll do quite a bit of study on ancient Greece. We'll do a little bit of study on Rome. We'll do a little bit of study on the flood narratives. And we'll do a little bit of study on geography, get us familiar with the place that we're going to be talking about. And then we're going to go through some timelines just to put ourselves in the context of what it must have been like to live here in Thessaloniki during the time period that we're going to be studying. We'll also get to see a video. I'm not going to do the audio for you, but the link to the audio is inside the Bible.com app that we host everything on, and you can go back and watch the video if you want to with that. I guess at this point, I've probably logged close to 12 hours of watching historical videos that I'm going to try to summarize down to about 20 minutes. So I'm not going to flood you. But you say, Chad, why in the world would we spend, because I always get this question, I thought I was at a Bible study. Why are we talking about all this history stuff? Because if you don't understand the history, you do not understand the context in which it was written. And if you don't understand the context in which it was written, you can't accurately understand what it was meant to tell you. Because all you can then do is take it and change it into what it means to you. And whenever you change it into what it means to you, it ain't meaning what it was meant to mean. That's a lot of means in there, ain't it? And so this is what we're going to get down to tonight. We're going to try to bury ourselves in their culture, understand where they were living from, where they had come from, and what they were living in the midst of. And some of the things tonight, as we study this culture with one another, it is going to probably disturb you from being a good Southern person. And it should. But I want, as we move forward every week with one another, I'm going to constantly be drawing you back. Because if you ever escape what the culture is, you will misread 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Okay? So let's get started with some background. What is the defining event in Earth's history that changed the planetary concept of where humans existed and how land formations were? The scientists all call it what? The Big Bang. They call it Pangea. They refer to it as these things. They have all these explanations about what happened to the earth. When we studied Genesis with one another, do you all remember one of the narratives that is talked about in the culture of Mesopotamia? What's an alternative story to the biblical story that existed in Mesopotamia? Anybody that was here in Genesis, do you remember? It was a creation story, but it was also specifically about a worldwide flood. And it was about Marduk. Marduk being an ancient demonic god that later on was even worshiped, as we see into the Canaanite and other cultures. There is a parallel story to Noah out of our Bibles from the ancient times of Greece. That ancient story existed and told of how the Grecian people came about. Hey, Calvin, can you scoot somewhere over here so I can see all their faces? I want to make sure I don't. Or scoot down there by Mr. Ed or something like that. Thank you, buddy. So in this story of ancient Greece, the people of Greece wanted to know where they came from. Where did we as a people, being of Greek origin, come from? And so this story called and you can look it up later, there's plenty of actual historical documentation about it from antiquities and other documents that were written. But there's this story called the Deucalion took advice from his father. You see that on the screen there? He took advice from his father, Prometheus, and he constructed a what? Isn't that interesting? This is not the only flood narrative that we see in ancient history. There are many, many flood narratives. Why do you think that? Why do you think so many people would have a flood narrative? They would have to explain what they didn't understand. It also was a very common story that obviously had to have happened. How does a flood narrative spread across what we know as modern day Greece all the way to what we know as modern day India in a culture that didn't have Facebook? You know, how does that narrative spread that far? Because every culture experienced what? The flood. So whenever you look at this, this is how the Greeks said. This guy, he and his wife used the ark to escape the flood sent by Zeus. They came off the ark, though, and when they came off the ark, they were distracted by one of the goddesses, and she threw rocks behind them and recreated mankind out of these rocks. That is the story. Now, what's so interesting to me as I study my Bible, and as I asked myself as I started studying Thessalonians, I was like, well, that's kind of interesting. I wonder if I was from Thessaloniki, which is the name of the city during this time that we're studying with Paul. I wonder if I was from Thessaloniki, where I came from. Who are my ancestors? Where does my story start? And so I started asking myself that. Well, I wonder if we can trace back where these people come from biblically. It's amazing. They come from Javan, the son of Japheth, the son of Noah, is their lineage. Isn't that cool? Isn't that just absolutely amazing that this part of the world comes from something that we can go straight back to our biblical studies and be able to see that? I love that about the Bible. I love that about studying the Bible with y'all, because we take time and we don't try to preach a 20-minute message. We're trying to dig in. And if it's okay, if it takes us 16 weeks or 10 weeks or whatever, let's just dig in and chew on it for a while together. I think that's an excellent. Kelly's question is, why didn't they know that? We don't know for sure, but I would surmise from the text and from what we see about ancient society is, did the Israelites who were in captivity for 400 years in Egypt remember much of their origins? No. God had to draw them back in the desert to break them of what kind of worship? Idol worship. So within 400 years, they had lost that heritage that they had just within 400 years. Think about these people who we're studying in the time of Paul here around AD 52, AD 48, 52, somewhere around there. And now think about the age of the earth, biblically speaking, not based off of uranium dating and all these other kind of, datings that we have out there. I mean, if it's 6,000, 3,000 years old, think about how it deteriorates the understanding of where did you come from? And I think that's a very good question, because I would ask you, Where did you come? If somebody were to say, well, these people are just confused. Well, let me ask you, did you know your fifth great grandfather? Can you name his name today? Probably not. And that was only 5 great grandfathers ago. This is thousands of years. And so here are these people, and they come up with this story. I not only tell you this story for the reason that you see the flood narrative in parallel to Genesis, but I tell you this story because who is the one that saves them in their flood narrative? Zeus. That's right. It could have. Foster's saying, could it have been altered? Yes, absolutely, because it was passed down orally, right? I mean, written language as we know it, as we studied Exodus, we talked about the origin of written language. And we believe that Hebrew being one of the first alphabets that actually came out, because remember, before that, they had used Sanskrit, Ugaritic text, and they had used hieroglyphics from Egypt, which had like over 1,200 characters in it if you study hieroglyphics from Egypt. So the Hebrew language being structured in just the alphabet that it is gave us the root to the English alphabet even, and now stories can be easily documented, right? So we see this narrative, though, that uses Zeus as one of these individuals that supposedly saved this people group. So what do you think they begin to worship? Zeus, right? I mean, if anybody has saved you, the God of the Bible being Yahweh, the father of, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Esau, that is the God of the Israelites. Well, obviously, these people have chosen to follow a God that has been made up to follow their flood narrative. And so we see the very introduction of Greek mythology thousands of years. Do you see that? And why that's important? Because the area that we're studying physically is known as Macedonia. And Macedonia, and what you're looking at is a very zoomed in map. Italy is over here on the left. You're seeing modern day Greece and Corinth down in here, okay? And the Mediterranean Sea that we see, okay? So you should geographically be able to recognize this today. Okay? I can't hear you. Italy's over to the left over here, near the Adriatic Sea, okay? And so we've got Greece and Corinth and Cyprus and all these islands over here. And then let's just, for kicks and giggles, I want to show you, let's look real quick, just so you can get an idea. I hope the internet bandwidth is good enough here. Come on. I should have had this up already. I'm sorry. What I want you to do is get a sort of big picture view of where we're talking about, because it is important in understanding how Paul moves in his missionary journeys, which is really what we're going to get into and follow tonight real quick. Come on, Google Earth. This is a big program, so it doesn't go quick. All right. So we're in the city of Thessaloniki here, so let's zoom out. Let me spin the map. Let me zoom back out. All right. So let's look where we are. Italy is over here on the left. You see that? Here's Greece, what we're going to be studying. You see Thessaloniki, right? And then Ephesus, all over here. You see that? Asia Minor as we know it. The Black Sea up here. And we begin to move toward Russia. So this is really where we're talking about. And you see that there's this capability of moving out of Asia Minor. Let's zoom out just a little bit more. You see Turkey here, what we know as modern day Turkey. Look at how somebody could make their way over to Greece. You could cross that land bridge there, or if you had passage fare, you could sail across the sea right there, and you could be in Greece relatively easy, right? If you sailed out of the ports of Ephesus and other ports during biblical time. And so here is Thessaloniki, okay? And it's up here. You see it right here, okay? I want you to look at how populated. Now, you see there's mountain ranges all around, And if you'll notice, if we zoom in on Thessaloniki, I want you to see what kind of city it is today. This is all this color that you see here. These are all cityscapes. These are all buildings. It is a highly, highly densely populated area. Okay? You see that? Thessaloniki, if you know a little bit about the history of it, it's a major seaport town. It was a good trading facility, had a lot of trade that could come through it. Through the Greek Empire, they really saw money develop out of a bartering system toward the Roman Empire where coins began to be exchanged. And this is where a lot of trade would occur along this Mediterranean around that border, right? Because we could sail along the edge of the sea and trade our goods. All right, so Thessaloniki becomes a really popular place. And during the time that we're studying, Thessaloniki is actually about 200,000 people. It's a large city. I mean, 200,000 people is not a small place today by any stretch. What's interesting is we're going to study in the book of Acts that as Paul made his journey around through here to talk to Philippi and Thessaloniki and Berea, look how close they are to one another. Just to give you an idea, Thessalonica is only 39 miles from Berea. It's only about, look, maybe 50 miles or so from Philippi. We read these places in our Bible and we don't even look at the geography and we're like, how did they chase Paul from Thessalonica to Berea? It wasn't nothing for them to walk 39 miles. They walked everywhere. So when they chased him out of town that we're going to study, they just chased him straight to Berea. And finally, Berea gets so contested that he leaves Berea and they're like, Paul, we got to get you to go to Athens to get you away from these people because they hate you so bad. Can you imagine? So, and look how far Athens is. Athens a haul now. We're not just going to set foot for a day and go visit Athens, right? I mean, it's a haul. So let's move on past the map, and now let's talk about Paul's life. Paul is the author of the book of Thessalonians, the letter to the Thessalonians, I should say. Paul, whenever he was on, and let's just hit a couple of highlights on Paul's life here. Paul was raised into what culture? He was a Jewish Israelite of what descent? Roman. Paul had dual citizenship, for lack of a better way to say it. He was Roman and he was an Israelite. What made him an Israelite? His mother. She was an ancestral Jew, and you have to be born of a Jew to be an ancestral Jew. Your father doesn't get you that. Your mother gets you that. Okay? So he's born an Israelite in Tarsus, and he becomes a Roman citizen as well. And people throughout the Bible, you know, you read Paul's name was originally what? Saul. Well, did God give him that? Well, yeah, he did, but his parents gave him that. And why does he have the name Saul and Paul? Because he carries two different names depending on what culture he's communicating with. It's not like Peter where he got a separate name. You are the rock. He was given a name by God. Paul was given these two names from his parents based on where he operated in culture. Okay? So Paul trained underneath Gamaliel. Gamaliel being one of the highest Pharisees of the time. And so that means if Paul was able to train underneath Gamaliel as a Jewish student, he was considered extremely brilliant as a child. He showed promise. And so where poor old Peter, to use Peter, whenever Peter went through the classroom, Peter got to that certain age and the old synagogue leader said, Peter, you done real good so far, son. It's time for you to go fishing. And so he sent him fishing. But Paul, whenever the synagogue leader came to Paul, would have said, Paul, you got it, buddy. I'm going to send you on to the next level, and we'll see if you keep getting it. And Paul would have graduated into that class that we know biblically as a Pharisee. Okay? So Paul's a Pharisee, and he actually is present at the stoning of Stephen. Paul literally holds the robes of the people that stoned Stephen after the death of Jesus Christ. If you recall, I love our Bibles, y'all. I love how our Bibles are so interconnected. And it's unfortunate we so often skip through this. But do you remember how oftentimes Jesus would talk about people's ears? And he says, you have what? Ears to hear, but you do not hear? Whenever Stephen started to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, starting with the ancient history of the Israelites, and taught these people through why Jesus was the Mashiach, the Messiah of the Israelites, what does it say they did? Did you hear that? That preaches me happy. They covered the ears. I don't want to hear it anymore. Stop. Have you ever been around somebody that you know you're telling them the truth and they don't want to hear it anymore? And if it wouldn't make them look silly, they'd put their fingers in there and go, I can't hear you. Really? I mean, that's literally what we're doing. You can't do that to your husband, Landy. so, but Paul, on his way as a good Pharisee, is protecting the Jewish people in his mind. And he's exterminating this cultish way known as the way, which are the followers of Jesus. And as he's doing this, he's persecuting these followers of this false prophet Jesus in his mind. And he's chasing them throughout the countryside to eradicate them. And he's been sent by the Sanhedrin, with letters authorizing him to be able to do so, to either take them captive or to do whatever else he needed to. But on his way, he reaches a road into a city called Damascus, and he meets the Savior on that road. The two other people traveling with him undeniably say, there was a voice. And Paul is blinded at that moment. Scales came upon his eyes, literally to cover him because the light was so brilliant. And he's led into this city, and he's led, a man not wanting to, is led to Paul and says, I give upon, and lays upon him hands and transfers the Holy Spirit upon Paul, and these scales fall from his eyes, but his eyes from that point forward for the rest of his life were damaged. You say, Chad, how do you know that? Where's that in your Bible? Well, as you read your Bible, what you find out is that Luke, who is not an apostle, Luke, who was a friend of Paul's, was a medical doctor at that time. Luke was from a region that a salve for eyes was made in. And Luke provided this salve to Paul and became a friend of his and traveled with Paul all along Paul's journeys. And you say, Chad, but how do you know his eyes continue to be damaged? As you read the letters of antiquity and you see Paul's writing, Paul says at one point, this thorn in my flesh. Paul then speaks also about, he says, you will see I write in my own handwriting. If you're blind, how do you have to write to be able to see it? In big letters. And so over and over again, we sort of had these indications of Paul's eyesight. And Paul is never without someone. Is that correct? Paul is led throughout. He's like Mr. Magoo. He's led through the rest of his life as he travels from city to preach the gospel, the good news, the euangelion, as it's called. And so here's Paul. He goes back to Jerusalem. Then Paul goes away from Jerusalem, and we lose Paul. We lose Paul for 3 years. Paul, where did Paul go? This guy that had this miraculous conversion. Where did Paul end up? He ends up in the deserts of Arabia for 3 years. Essentially, for lack of a better way to say it, some people might not like the way I'm about to say this, but being reprogrammed. Meeting the risen Savior, Jesus Christ, for 3 years in the deserts of Arabia and finding out all that his knowledge has taught him through his training as a Pharisee to now understanding who he is in Jesus Christ and equipping Paul with the truth of who the Mashiach is to prepare him for his journeys that would ultimately lead to his death. Sir? A true sabbatical. Yes, a very true sabbatical. So Paul meets the risen Lord for a second time in the deserts of Arabia, and now Paul goes on these journeys. So Paul begins to minister throughout what is known as Turkey. He goes on multiple missionary journeys. He goes on his first journey and comes back. And then as he gets ready to go on his second journey, he's going to go again. And he says, I ain't going to take John Mark with me. I don't like him. He deserted us. He ain't worth going. He ain't got the moxie that it takes. He ain't got the steel in his gut to be able to do what it is we're going to do. And so Paul and who? Barnabas have a falling out. Well, I like the kid. Well, you would like him. You sissy. You know, I don't know if you know, but Paul didn't cut the fluff with anybody. When Paul said something, Paul just, bam, here it is. When him and Peter go at it, I mean, Peter and Paul were two of the ones that would go at it in the Jerusalem council. They didn't have any problems at all with going against one another. I can imagine that Paul's that kind of guy that if you ain't got thick skin, Mr. Ed, you might not want to hang around Mr. Paul because Paul's going to tell you like it is. Barnabas probably was a little bit of a shepherd. He was probably a little bit of more of a pastoral kind of guy. Well, I know you, a lot of pastors, I think they just wish they could tell people like it is. You're just stupid. But pastors often have to be kind and have to say, well, now, we need to think through this, and we need to talk about it for 30 minutes. Paul would have said, well, you're just dumb. What did you expect was going to happen? That's how Paul was. And so Paul is on this pathway, and he goes on down through here, and he leaves the Jerusalem council, as you see right here in about 49 AD. They go on about their journeys, and then we see down here around Acts 17. So you say, Chad, what does all this have to do with my Bible? Well, if you start reading in Acts about chapter 16, you're going to pick Paul up on this journey, okay? And Paul starts traveling out of Jerusalem to begin to visit places to build churches. What do you mean build churches? Was he taking a sack full of money and they were building buildings? No. He was going around and he was meeting people where they were. Typically, Paul would first go to the Jewish synagogue in a place. How many men does it take to have a Jewish synagogue? 10. The way you remember that is it has to have a minyan, like that movie with them little yellow men. That's how I remember that. And so you have to have a minyan to form a Jewish synagogue, and Paul would go to there if he had it, and do what? The minions, groom, that part, yeah. So you have to have a minyan, 10 men, and so they would form a synagogue, and then if he couldn't find a synagogue, where did the people usually meet? Their homes, where else? Famous country song written about it. Down by the river. Soggy Bottom Boys sung it in that movie. Y'all remember what I'm talking about? Down by the river. Where did he find Lydia at? Down by the river. You see? Isn't that cool? And so he found them worshiping Yahweh down by the river. And so if he couldn't find a synagogue, that's where he'd go first, is he'd go and they'd say, ooh, it's Paul. Let's let him preach a series. And he'd preach a series and then they'd kick him out. He'd get run out of the synagogue and he'd hang out with the rest of the folks. So Paul's making his way through the area. Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, and he's establishing churches, just people getting together in a building. He's establishing churches all along that path. And he comes along this path and he stirs up trouble everywhere he goes. Every place he goes, he stirs up trouble. How did he stir up trouble in Ephesus? Because it's important for what we're studying tonight. How did he stir up trouble in Ephesus? Y'all remember they almost killed him. Come on, somebody tell me. Artemis of the Ephesians, and the silversmiths got together, remember, and they said, you know what? This man's going to rob us of our pay. He's going to do away with our living. He's got to shut up. They drug him. Remember, they had they went to the theater in Ephesus, and they riled everybody up. And the proconsul come in and said, what are y'all doing here? Well, it's against this guy named Paul. And they said, y'all better disband before we get accused by the Romans of creating a riot. And they drove him out of Ephesus because he was preaching against the gods of the Romans. Y'all hear that? That's very important. Where did the city and the people of Thessaloniki originate from in their mind? The gods of the Romans. The gods of the Greeks, but through the Romans adopted the Greek gods. So, oh my goodness. So Paul, look at this. They passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, and at Thessaloniki he preached Christ, but he had to flee. How long? We're going to study this here in a minute. Paul was only in Thessalonica for 3 weeks. So these letters we see him write back are from 3 weeks of being in town. Now, again, we take it for granted, and y'all are going to be like, Chad, why'd you have to say that? We're smarter than that. I'm not saying that you're dumb. I'm just saying let's think about our Bible in the text for a minute. What Bible did they hold in their hands in 51 AD? The Torah, the Tanakh. They had what we could consider our Old Testament scriptures, the Torah, the Netavim, and the Ketuvim. They would hold those collection of documents. What had not been written yet? The New Testament. Man, we just take that for granted when we read this. We think, oh, well, they had what? No. We're living through the scriptures, these things happening. And so we don't need to forget that, because these people have been raised and steeped in Roman mythology since the very beginning. Here's something very captivating about what happened in ancient Greece. King Philip was a Macedonian. Philip II was a Macedonian. Why is Philip II important? Because of his son. Who was his son? Alexander the Great, around 300 BC. So here we have Philip II ruling in the area, and where is Thessalonica? In the region of Macedonia. Let's go back to the map real quick. This whole region that you see up here is called Macedonia. And then the region down here is called Achaia. See that? That's directly from Scripture, by the way. Macedonia originates from the Macedonian people who were considered by the Romans to be barbarians. These people today still hold on to some cultural artifacts that they celebrate today in weddings and other things. But these people were considered by the Romans, who lived just across the Adriatic Sea from them, to be absolute barbarians. And what we know about Rome, and we think Rome was a little barbaric. So, just for a minute here, you see people and you think, well, that person's this way, and then you see a person that's worse than that, and you go, oh, well, that completely recategorizes how I think about these people. That redneck just took on a whole new, light kind of thing. And that's the way they thought about these Macedonians. But who came out of that culture? And you say, well, Chad, help me understand. Alexander the Great came out of that culture. What was that culture? What do we know about Alexander the Great from a sexuality standpoint? Does anybody know? In modern terms, we say he swung both ways. He was a homosexual. He was bisexual. His father was bisexual. His father was possibly killed because his father, Philip, was executed outside. Hey, David. His father was executed outside of one of the venues, and his father was executed, and they believe, possibly, this cannot be 100% corroborated through antiquity, but his father was possibly executed by one of his ex-lovers. Man, by the way. Male. Alexander the Great comes into power at 13 years of age, and Alexander the Great begins to then develop a war plan through Macedonia and Achaia, and then begins to conquer. In the time of Philip, Macedonia pretty much ruled around the rim of the Mediterranean. just the countries around the rim. Literally, like if you were to draw it, you would just see like a small painted line around the rim of the Mediterranean, that Libya and all those areas that he ruled in. When Alexander the Great came on the scene, though, no, it's like it grew. It grew to India and Iraq and north into like Russia and Turkey and all. I mean, when he came on the scene, he completely changed how his dad had went to war and subjected the culture to that kind of worship and spread that culture throughout the rest of the known world in that time period. And the spread of Ephesus and all these things that we know stem out of that God worship and that demonic worship coming out of that period. Just to give you a little bit of cultural background, real quick. If you were to live in Thessalonica during this time, if you were country people, if you were like lived in Deatsville, if you were country people, you had milk on a regular basis because you had goats. They did not drink cow's milk very often. Cattle were primarily used as farm implements. They were used to drag plows and wagons and all that kind of stuff. Horses were very unusual to have. They were most often, horses were had by the richest of people. The Roman, yes, for that reason. the aristocracy had them usually. If you lived in the city, if you lived in the city proper, you usually didn't drink milk. You usually drank watered down wine because the water was so filthy. It would have bacteria and other stuff in it. They didn't know it really, but the water was all jacked up with all kind of problems. So they would mix it with fermentation to cut it. When you went to the bathroom, you would go to the bathroom sitting in an area much like this, and if you were really rich, you had marble topped bathrooms. Now that's some wealth, by the way, y'all. We have marble top countertops. They had marble top benches. And whenever we went to the bathroom together, Wes, we would sit next to one another while we did our business, have a chit chat. And literally, and then the people that were less wealthy had wood top benches that you would sit on. I don't know if y'all have ever had a splinter in your rear end. I have. It don't feel good. And to ask somebody to help you get it out ain't no fun. Thank God for mamas. Mama, I got to show you something. So this was a also you bathed together. Whenever we bathed, we would oftentimes, if you were the wealthy of the wealthiest, you might have a bathing chamber at your home, but most often you didn't. In this time period, we would actually bathe together in large bathing areas or down at the creek, wherever we need to. Um, they didn't have toilet paper. Some people, they had a communal sponge. Oh, how horrible. Other people used rocks. You've got to be kidding me. You've got to be kidding me. Rocks. Yes, rocks. How do we know that? You don't want to know. You don't, ma'am? Yeah. So they did have running water through the latrines, through these areas. But can you imagine? I mean, bathing with that many people in a large pool. You know, water ain't getting changed out all the time. The homes, they would have typically 4 meals a day. You would have a really quick meal right after you got out of bed. I'm all for this. You jump right out of bed and they'd have a really quick meal, typically of grain and barley and oats or something like that. They raised olives extensively in this part of the world. Even, we think of olives as Israel, massive olive groves in this part of the world. The olive trees were used for food, for housing, for shipbuilding. I mean, it was a big deal to have olives. They would eat figs, grapes for breakfast. They would then have a mid-morning snack, and it would usually consist of a little bit more, fruits, vegetables, that kind of stuff, cucumbers, that kind of stuff. The weather is very similar to what we experience here. They would have very cold winters sometimes and very hot summers other times. And then as things progressed through the day, you would go into a lunchtime, and then lunchtime was usually mid-afternoon, and then you would have a big dinner. And dinner would consist of a really good meal, typically not meat, typically fish or some other produce of some sort, and then a really good dessert. They had lots of good desserts. Honey was prolific. They really enjoyed honey in a lot of different ways, in their drinks, in their desserts, and that was these people. Uh, Most people, by what they can tell, were not extremely obese, as you can expect. They wore tunics. They would wear these cloths that were draped around them. I almost told Kelly I'd like for her to make me a tunic, and I was like, no, nobody wants to see me in a tunic. But they would drape them. Men and women would wear these, and they would wrap them around themselves, and they would be clasped. And the richer you were, please stop. The richer you were, you would begin to have nicer things, headbands, and you know amulets that would hold your tunic together up here, and wraps, sashes that would go around you. The more money you had, the more you adorned yourself with these kind of things, earrings, all those kinds of things, right? Um, in that part of the world, you typically, if you were a regular common person like us, you would wear a cotton tunic, something along those kind of lines. The wealthy people, though, had silk, silk and foreign material. You say, well, that doesn't sound much different than us today, right? I mean, what kind of suit is that? Oh, that's an Armani. Well, who gives a rip? I can't even spell Armani, much less play one. So here we are. We've got this. World's not changed, and so here we are in Thessalonica. So let's go down here and let's talk about the city, or talk about how Paul travels. Paul, as he writes these letters out of his travel, First and Second Thessalonians was really one of the first letters that Paul wrote. So we're like getting first glimpse at what he was writing to the churches. Corinthians came not much further after that. Philippians after that. Galatians, Romans, quite a ways after that. We go down to Colossians, Philemon, Ephesians. These are the general order that scholarly people believe that the letters were written as you study the Bible. These are not in the same order they're in our New Testament, are they? Wouldn't it be nice if they were? I mean, where did we get that wrong? Why couldn't we just write them in the order they were? Here's something that's interesting. As you think about Thessalonica, now modern day Salonika, is located in what is today modern day Greece. About 200,000 people lived during Paul's day. It was originally named Therma. How would you like to live there? So renamed after the half-sister of Alexander the Great, we talked about. In 1943, there was about 54,000 Jews that were rounded up. Annie, I'm asking you to stop. Thank you. About 54,000 Jews were rounded up. That represented about 90% of the Jewish population in that city. And they were rounded up by the Nazis and taken away to Jewish death camps. And only about 1,200 Jews exist in the city today based on estimations. There's a beautiful Jewish Holocaust museum there, and there's a beautiful statue. It looks much like the one that I had the opportunity to visit in Auschwitz, but it looks much like that statue with intermingled bodies to represent what happened, and it's near the coastline. It's a beautiful city. I'm going to show you this video. This is one of the great towers that were erected near the seaboard. This tower was actually whitewashed at one point, and it's one of the focal centerpieces from an historical standpoint within the city. There's only one area of antiquity that has been actually archaeologically recovered, and it is the Agora. The Agora is the modern day flea market, and that is where they would have, all of their goods being sold. And what you're seeing over the back of this gentleman here from Drive-Through History is you're seeing the actual theater that was at the Agora, and you're actually going to see into the Agora where the actual booths were, where they traded and sold goods, okay? This is actually about a 1-block area inside the middle of the city. The belief is that there is so much archaeological relics underground, but they can't get to them because look what's around the outside edge of the Agora. Sky rises, hotels, apartment buildings. Y'all, this is no small city. How many people in here have ever been to Boston? If you ever had a chance and you walk around Boston, it reminds me of Boston if you walk around Thessalonica. Boston, you've got lots of apartment buildings, and the streets are interconnected, and it's small and narrow, and you've got markets down the streets, and everybody has their shops on the bottom of the buildings, and everybody lives above the buildings that own the shops and all this kind of stuff. That's what modern day looks like. But you can see there are places literally back to the time of Paul that have been archaeologically recovered. Okay, so if you get a chance, I would encourage you to go watch that video in its totality. But you'll actually see some of the things that are available, and he'll lead you through some of the conversation there. All right, so let's jump in now to actually Acts 17. Acts 17. Now, Acts is generally referred to as the Acts of the Apostles. What constitutes you being an apostle? What makes you an apostle? You walked, you studied underneath Jesus Christ. Who is considered an apostle that we're studying? Paul. Hold on now. Paul was not a good guy while Jesus was here. Paul came to know Christ, remember, in the deserts of Arabia. Hence, Paul became an apostle. All throughout the life of Paul, we find that he is constantly bumping up against conflict to his apostleship. And at some points, he just comes back at you. Remember me saying Paul's one of the ones that just come back at you pretty hard? He just, at some points, will say, I don't have to tell you about me being an apostle. This is the reason why I'm just going to move on past this issue. And so Paul was constantly bumping up against it. But Paul leaves the Council of Jerusalem, and on his second missionary journey, he has three journeys, but as he's moving through this area, and he moves out of Asia Minor, and he starts moving across the top of Greece, he begins to visit Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens. He's working his way down, okay? And that's where we're joining Paul in the book of Acts, okay? Now, when they had traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews, meaning what? 10 or more, right? I mean, we love knowing our history because it helps us understand what the Bible is telling us. They had a constituency of Jewish people within Thessalonica. And according to Paul's custom, which is what he normally did, he went to the synagogue, to the Jewish people. And for 3 Sabbaths, he reasoned with them from the scriptures. What do you reckon he's reasoning about? Jesus, who the Mashiach is. I am preaching Christ and Christ crucified, is what Paul would say. And he is reasoning with these Jews, saying, let me show you. Just like Stephen was yelling out before he was stoned with Paul standing there, I can imagine Paul was going through the exact same discourse. Let me tell you about who Father Abraham was worshiping out of the land of Ur. He came to know Adonai. Remember, they wouldn't say Yahweh. Jewish people wouldn't, because it was the name. Yes, David. Now, possibly in Thessalonica, they were interspersing that. It is possible, but we don't know that for sure. But they were surrounded by a culture worshiping idols for sure. And according to Paul's custom, he went from there, and for 3 Sabbaths, he reasons with them, trying to convince them, listen, our Old Testament leads us to this Yeshua, and explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer. Now remember, Jesus' name was not first name Jesus, last name Christ. Christ was his title, the Christos. And the evidence that the Christ, the Mashiach, had to suffer, and he had to rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I proclaim to you, this Yeshua, he is the Mashiach. In the synagogue, we're reading this, by the way, in a translation out of the Roman language, right? We read it coming out of that. But he's speaking to who? Jewish men. Meaning he would have spoken what language to them primarily? He would have been speaking Hebrew to these men. And you think for a moment, you're sitting here and you think, he's proclaiming to you that Jesus is the Christ. What is the city that surrounds this synagogue proclaiming to them about who is God? We studied it just a few minutes ago. Who is being proclaimed by the city that surrounds this? Jews. You see that? What kind of culture is this little bitty pocket of Jewish people? What kind of culture are they experiencing in regards to what they have been taught by their faith? Homosexuality, idol worship, self-indulgence. You know, it was hedonism, as we would refer to it today, at its greatest. And the way you get ahead is by promoting yourself. You know what I'm talking about? And so here, and he says in verse 4, and some of them were persuaded and joined. Who's with Paul? Silas. It's important because we're going to read that in Thessalonians next week. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with a large number of God-fearing Greeks and a number of the leading women. Now, here's something interesting about this culture. Typically in Rome, especially in Greek society, women didn't have a whole lot of rights. You would go to school for a little while, especially in Rome, the women at least could read and write. But after that, you were pretty much in charge of the house. But we do see some small places, not only in biblical documents, in other historical documents, where women actually led businesses, where they were landowners, which was extremely unusual, where women did have some kind of right. We never see women really, though, in politics, in leadership roles of government, but we do see women in the philosophical realm, literally as a philosopher. We see there is a historical document supporting a woman, I can't remember her name right this second, but she operated as a philosopher during this time period. But what we're seeing is there's this large group of people that were being preached to in the city that were not just Jewish people. That means Paul was doing what? He was preaching outside of the synagogue too. People were coming to know this, because what would Paul do? What do we know Paul would do if he could not get good attention in the synagogue? What would he do? Building, to just start telling. You say, well, how do you know that? In Ephesus, he rented the building, remember? And he preached there for years, taught there for years. And so here we see that Paul is gathering these people. But the Jews becoming jealous, why would they become jealous if he was only teaching in the synagogue? Do you see? You reading the scripture? Slow down and read it. You have to read. What I like to say is you need to read in between the lines. It's telling you something, you just got to slow down and see it. But the Jews becoming jealous and taking along some wicked men from the marketplace formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. If he was only limited to just preaching in that synagogue, what does the rest of the city care? That's exactly right. Because we know Paul is skilled in what craft? That is the absolute truth. It's tent making. What do we know that probably meant during Paul's time that he made? Sails. Ship sails. Well, why would that matter in Thessalonica? They're right on the seaboard. Do you see why history is so important? Paul's sitting here, and Paul tells them in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, he says, you get busy with your hands. Just because you've become a Christian, just because you've become a follower of Jesus Christ, and you don't know when he's going to return, by golly, don't you sit there and be a no-good, do-nothing busybody. Get yourself busy. And Paul, throughout all of his journeys, supported his own ministry primarily. Now, he received gifts, but Paul will tell you, I did not sit around and just wait for handouts. And he didn't ask for them, yes. And so, but the Jews becoming jealous and taking along some wicked men from the marketplace, meaning what kind of men probably? Romans, non-Jewish people. Well, why would people in the marketplace get upset at Paul? What had he already done in Ephesus? He had tried to drive people away from the worship of the gods. What are the people in Thessalonica selling in the marketplace? Gods and idols. Man, he just keeps bumping up against the same thing. And so Jason, taking some wicked men from the market, formed a mob in the city as an uproar and attacking the house of Jason. Jason, what's up with Jason, man? Jason's the hotel for Paul. Where's Paul staying? Jason's house. Because we don't have hotels, really, motels. He's staying at Jason. They were seeking to bring them out to the people. Hold on. Bring who out? Paul and Silas. Thank you. That's perfect, y'all. I mean, Paul and Silas. And when they did not find them, where? At Jason's house, they began dragging Jason. Oh, what does this mean they did to enter Jason's? What did they do at Jason's house? They broke in. The mob. We take so much for granted. Were there police in the time of Thessalonica? No. No. There was government rule, and I could bring Wes with me to before the government council and say, he has wronged me, and the government could do something from that standpoint, but there's not police as we know them. No. He was a believer. He was a believer. So they were seeking to bring him out to the people. When they did not find him, they began dragging Jason and some, meaning who? Other people that had come to know, trust in what Paul was saying about Jesus before the city authorities, shouting, these men have upset the world. They have come here also. Where did they get notice that he had upset the world from? Ephesus. And Jason has welcomed them, and they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar because they were Caesar. Let's talk about this real quick. See, I knew we wouldn't get that far. Caesar has been set up now as what in the minds of the Romans? He portrays himself as a god. So when Paul takes action against God and he preaches another king named who? Jesus. Who is Paul preaching in opposition to? The Caesar. Do you see how big this deal is? If you can't assassinate his character, assassinate him the way they did Daniel. They couldn't get Daniel because he was not doing well. They could only get Daniel because they knew he would not compromise his faith. And the same is being used against Paul. You want to know what's going to be used against us in the time of Revelation? Whenever they're going to come after us? Your faith. We just studied it together. Isn't that amazing? This story is not yet fully written. Your faith will be what is used against you on purpose. Because if you're living your life in such a way to reflect Jesus Christ, the government or mankind will not know how to come against you. And all they can use against you is your faith. That ought to be very convicting. We ought to be able to sit there and ask ourselves, is my faith such that they would have to trap me in it and make a law against my faith to bring me before someone to have me killed? Or is my faith not strong enough that nobody could tell? That's what these people were dealing with. And they say, they're saying out loud in verse 7, and Jason is welcoming them into his home, and they all are contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king named Jesus. They stirred up the crowd, just like they did in Ephesus. Y'all let this go, and he's going to ruin all of us. And the city authorities who heard these things, the people, where were the city's authorities sitting? Where did you sit as the authorities? At the agora. You would bring, where the business occurs, you would have people. So they're drawing, and why would the artisans, if he had only visited the synagogues, why would the artisans know anything about what Paul was doing? Where would Paul have to transact his business? In the marketplace, in the agora. And so why would they know anything about what he's teaching? Because I am sure that while Paul is sitting there working on this, he's talking to people. Let me tell you about who is king of the earth. And I can see him sewing with that big old needle. Preaching it, boy. Preaching it right where he sits. Well, I don't know that I'm allowed to talk about my faith in business. Hockey. You can talk, Paul talked about it. I talk about it where I am, and you can talk about it where you are. Doggone it, live it and do it. So here he is. He says, and then when they had received a pledge from Jason and others, they released them. A pledge? What kind of pledge? Bail money. I'll cover him. Get out. We'll get him out of here. Don't you worry about it. Golly, we didn't even make it all the way through Acts. Okay, let me stop the recording real quick.